Can you describe the halting problem? Because it's a thing that shows up in a very useful and, again, traumatic way through a lot of computer science, through a lot of mathematics.
Yeah, the halting problem is expressing a fundamental property of computational processes. So given a program, or maybe we think of it as a program together with its input, but let me just call it a program. So given a program, we could run that program, but I want to pose it as a decision problem. Will this program ever complete its task? Will it ever halt? You know, the halting problem is the question. Given a program, will it halt? Yes or no? And of course, for any one instance, the answer is either yes or no. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about whether there's a computable procedure to answer all instances of this question. So it's a decision problem is given as a scheme of instances for all possible programs that you could ask about. What I want to know is there a computable procedure that will answer those questions, right? And it turns out the answer is no. The halting problem is computably undecidable. There is no computable procedure that will correctly answer all instances of whether a given program will halt. And of course, we can get half the answers in the sense that you give me a program and you say, will this halt? And I could take that program and I could run it.
Mm-hmm.
And I could keep running it. And maybe in a week it would halt. And at that time I could say, yes, it halted. So I can get the yes answers correctly for halting, all the yes answers. But the problem is, if it didn't halt yet, like maybe I waited, 1,000 years and it still hasn't halted, I don't seem entitled to say, no, it's not going to halt yet, because maybe in 1,001 years it'll halt. And so at no point can I seem to say no. In order to say no, it won't ever halt, it seems like I would have to really understand how the program worked and what it was doing. So giving the yes answers was sort of trivial. You didn't have to understand it. You just needed to run it, which is a kind of rote task. But to give the no answers, you need to have a kind of deep insight into the nature of the program and what it's doing in such a way that you would understand it and be able to see, oh no, I can see this program is never going to halt because, it's a much more difficult task to say, no, it won't halt than it is to say, yes, it halted because I ran it and it halted. And it turns out to be impossible to have a computable procedure that gives the no answers. Yeah. And the argument is not very difficult. Should we do it?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. Suppose toward contradiction, all these proofs are by contradiction. And this argument is going to be a diagonal argument in the same style as the Russell argument and the Cantor argument and Gödel's argument that we haven't talked about yet. So many diagonal arguments come in. So suppose towards contradiction that we had a procedure for determining whether a given program halted on a given input. Now let me describe. I'm going to use that procedure as a subroutine in the following process. And my process, let's call it Q, process Q. And it takes as input a program P. Okay. And the first thing it does is it asks that subroutine, hey, would P halt if I ran it on P itself? Okay. That's the diagonal part because we're applying P to P, right? Okay. So I'm describing program Q. And program Q takes as input P, which is itself a program. And the first thing it does is it asks the halting subroutine program, would P halt on P? And if the answer comes back from the subroutine, yeah, that would halt, then what I do in program Q is I immediately jump into an infinite loop. So I don't halt. If P halts on P, I don't halt. But if the answer came back, no, P is never going to halt on P, then I halt immediately. Okay, so and that's it. I've described what Q does. And the thing about Q is that Q's behavior on P was the opposite of P's behavior on P. That's how we designed Q specifically so that Q on P had the opposite behavior as P on P. Okay, so now, of course, what do we do? Well, the same thing that Russell did and so forth and Cantor, we ask, well, what would Q do on Q And because of this opposite behavior, Q would halt on Q if and only if Q does not halt on Q, which is a contradiction, because Q has to have the opposite behavior on Q than Q does, but that's just contradictory.
What a beautiful proof.
It's
Simple.
absolutely beautiful. Yeah, I agree. And it's following the same logic of Russell and Cantor. I mean, going back to Cantor, basically, because Russell is also quoting Cantor in his letter to Frege. So therefore, the conclusion is that the halting problem is not computably decidable. And now we can immediately prove Gödel's theorem using this. Actually, it's an immediate consequence. So why don't we just do that? I view this as the simplest proof of Gödel's theorem. You don't need the Gödel sentence to prove Gödel's theorem. You can do it with the halting problem. So suppose that we could write down a computable axiomatization of all of the true facts of elementary mathematics, meaning arithmetic and finite combinatorial things such as Turing machine computations and so on. So in fact, all those finite combinatorial processes are formalizable inside arithmetic with the standard arithmetization coding process. But let me just be a little bit informal and say, suppose we could write down a complete theory of elementary finite mathematics. So we have an axiomatization of that theory. Then we could produce all possible theorems from those axioms in the way that I was describing earlier with Hilbert's program. I mean, if we had a complete theory of elementary mathematics, we could construct a theorem enumeration machine that produced all the theorems and only the theorems from that theory. So now I have this theorem enumeration device on my desk, and I announce that I'm open for business to solve the halting problem. So you give me a program and input that you want to run that program on, and I'm going to answer the halting problem. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm just going to wait for the statement coming out of the theorem enumeration device that asserts either that P does halt on that input, or I wait for the statement that P does not halt on that input. But one of them is going to happen because it was a complete theory that was enumerating all the true statements of elementary mathematics. So therefore, if I had such a system, I could solve the halting problem. But we already proved that you cannot solve the halting problem. So therefore, you cannot have such a complete theory of arithmetic. So that proves Gödel's theorem.